Okay. Yeah. So I think I was muted. I didn't realize. All right. So hello everyone. Let's start with this session. Today's session is a very important one again. And as you know that we've been going through the entire gamut of research and publications in the webinar here, a series of 8 webinars, and we'll be covering the basics. We're trying to simplify as much as possible. At the same time, within the restrictions of time, we are trying to give you the basic concepts. So today again, we'll be taking you through the study designs, and my colleague, Dr. Praveen Kulkarni, he will take you through the sample size estimation and the sampling techniques. So I will start off with the segment on study designs, and I'll give you an overview how it's applied to research in biomedical sciences and more specifically in the field of health sciences. And we'll look at some of these. I'm sure some of you are experienced, but we will try to give you some of these concepts and which might be some of these additional new knowledge that you will build on. And please feel free to have your questions jotted down. You can put them on chat box or keep it holding, and we will take all the questions in the end. The plan is I'll go on for about 25, maximum 25 to 30 minutes, and Dr. Praveen takes over, and then he goes on, and we will stop at around 9:15 so that we have ample time for discussion. So 9:10 to 9:15 we plan to stop, and then we will take questions so that we have about 15 to 20 minutes of discussion. So with that, let me start off. Now, what exactly is a study? What is a study? Let's start with that. So basically, we think that many times that we have an idea, but many times we sometimes are not very clear with that. So basically, a study is nothing but it's a scientific process of answering a question using data from population. And this can be anything. It can be a question which relates to treatment, it can relate to prognosis, it can lead to magnitude of the problem, it can be anything. So basically, it's a scientific process which helps in answering a question. And when we do this, we are able to probably come out with certain answers, and sometimes we also lead it for next question, which always helps us to further the science itself. And that's the idea. So basically, we've dealt with the research question already, and we've tried to give you an idea of review of literature. Now, if we want to know that, how smoking leads to lung cancer and things like how are the differences between two countries about certain things, or whether a particular factor or foodstuff leads to something, or is it, unhealthy, or it leads to some disease, or is it protective against something else? How do we know all this? We need to do a scientific study. And that's the idea of taking up this segment to give you an idea that how do we go about. Now, please remember, this is something which we have shown you earlier also in different way, but this is how we go about. So we start with a study question or a research question. We select a study type, which is part of a methodology, and then we collect and analyze data. Once we are done with analysis of data, we interpret the results that we get, and based on that, we come out with our findings, which are obviously reported. It can be presented, or it can be published, or it can be done both. So that's the idea. And we apply these results to whichever specialty we are from, so that we can make lives better and we can make our healthcare better. So with that, the objectives of this session are to outline the importance of selecting the right study design for research, to explain with example the various research study designs in epidemiology, and to summarize the process of choosing appropriate design for research. Now let's look at some of these objectives. Now, I would like to know the prevalence of hearing impairment among elderly people in Mangalore. Now this could be one of my objectives for a study. Now basically here I'm trying to quantify the problem. Or I'm trying to look at the hearing acuity among elderly population in Mangalore. So that could be another thing. Or to estimate the number of episodes of fractures in elderly in urban and rural areas. So number of episodes I want to, or I want to compare between two groups of people. That is osteoporosis in menopausal women with family history versus those who do not have a family history of osteoporosis. It could be any other thing. I'm just giving you examples. Or if I want to see how a particular drug is working in a particular clinical condition. So is it efficient? Is it efficacious enough? Or if I want to see whether multi-drug therapy or polytherapy is better, or a monotherapy in a particular clinical condition. So all these questions, and we get these in different types and different ways in our own specialities. Many a times we are puzzled and we are looking for answers. And that time we would like to get answers by doing research. And this is where it helps. So coming to the study designs. Now there are many types of studies. We will just cover some of the basics, but please remember, let me give you some idea. Now, study design is nothing but a basic framework for carrying out a study. When we propose a research, we need a basic framework to carry out a research, and that's what is achieved by this. Now, how do we decide on this? Very importantly, this is determined by a research question that I have at hand. So that will also determine. So based on that and based on my objective, I will select my study design. Of course, it will also have to be weighed against the feasibility and other aspects that I have. And sometimes there might be more types of study designs which fit my research question, but I may not be able to conduct a particular type depending on the feasibility. And that's why choice must be based on the basis of best feasibility. Now, what is the clinical profile of patients with presbyocusis or TB spine or any other? Or what is the diagnostic role of a particular type of diagnostic test in a particular condition? Here I have taken bone mineral density scan, that is BMD scan, in osteoporosis. So I would like to know such things. Or maybe I want to see two kinds of types of administration of drugs. So it can be oral administration or a parenteral administration, and how the efficacy will vary. So if I want to compare this, so these are some of the things, and each of these will lead me to decide which type of study I would like to do. So again, it's very important that we choose the appropriate study design to answer the question which I have taken up. Each of the study designs have its own strengths and weaknesses, which I'll touch on when I go forward. But please remember, we need to consider all these things, including the bias, confounding, and try to reduce them so that at the end, I have relatively confident conclusion which I come with, and I can say that, okay, these results point to this. Now, this is how the study designs are classified. Now, there are various ways if you go through, and somebody will talk about descriptive, analytical, and all. But if you look at it, this is simply a fine way of looking at it. So, did investigator assign exposure? Now, what is an exposure? Exposure, like any kind of exposure. It can be exposure which is artificial, or it can be natural. It can be, for example, exposure to smoking. It could be a passive smoking. It can be active smoking. It can be any. It can be exposure to a particular factor. So, is that assigned by the investigator? Is it under my control if I'm doing the study, or is it naturally occurring? If no, then it's an observational study. Is there a comparison group? So am I comparing with some other group which is not having an exposure or something like that? Or is it not there? If it's not there, then it's a descriptive. So that means I'm just seeing those people who are exposed and I'm describing all the things, and that's why it's a descriptive. So descriptive. If there are two groups, one with exposure, one without, and there is a comparison, so then it's an analytical study. Now, depending on the direction, I can look at that, and if I'm going from exposure to outcome, then it's cohorts. But if the outcome has already happened, and I'm going back to see what was the exposure, then it's a case control. And if the exposure and the outcome is being measured at the same time, that means today I start and I see what is the status of the person, what is the outcome of the disease or the outcome, whatever I'm looking at, and what exactly is the exposure today, not yesterday, not what it will happen tomorrow or something. So exposure and outcome at the same time today, that's a cross-sectional study. We will go into these. Now coming to the experimental study. Now experimental, again, we usually do some random allocation. So if I'm doing a random allocation, then this is a randomized control trial. And if it's not under my control, that means I cannot control the allocation to different groups randomly. That is without making any kind of judgmental or biased decision. So that's a non-randomized trial. So let's move forward. Now, there is something known as a ecological study. An ecological study, the idea is we look at groups of people. That means the whole kind of, community or maybe a geographical distribution or households. We don't go to individuals. My unit of study is group of people. So what is happening? So if I take exposure data and outcome data, I will take it as a group. And then I will come out with the results and project. These are done just to find out overall in a community, in a geographical area, in a country, in maybe say in a district or in some provinces, something like that. For completion's sake, let me tell you, because some people do not regard these as study designs and methodologies, but let me tell you that some books will give you, and including some of the very reputed journals. So this is one of the things which I would like to just touch on. So a case report. Now basically you come across something which is unique, which is different, and you think that this is worth reporting. So this is like a detailed presentation of something by one or more physicians, and this also helps in describing rare clinical events. It's also a source for formulation of hypothesis. That means since this has happened, that's the outcome. So we are postulating or hypothesizing. At the same time, it also helps us to find out or elucidate or explain the mechanism which leads to this. And it also helps us to describe unusual manifestations. And many diseases in the history, if you go, you will see that these are found because of somebody describing that there is something unusual. And even now when you look at journals, they have these case reports. Next is the case series. Now, case series is a number of such cases. So it's based on reports of a series of cases of a specific condition. There could be single or multiple sources. The use is, it again helps you formulate a hypothesis, and this will be definitely a little more stronger or better than a single or maybe two cases. So it's a more number of cases. It's informative of a very rare disease, and it also may suggest the emergence of a new disease. Like for example, like corona, there were certain cases seen, there was something different which was happening, and then they said yes, and that's how we led to this. Of course, we are very early in this stage of corona to know more about epidemiology of it, but yes, that's how it was. So useful in bringing attention to a new area. Now, case series usually describes the characteristics. It describes it in the same disease or exposure, same exposure or same disease, and it helps us to know about the presentation, the demographic, that is, what is the age, what is the gender, what is the characteristics of the population, what is the prognosis, all these things. And certain examples, if I can take, unusual pneumonia in men, which was observed and reported, that led to HIV, phocomelia, that is seal-like limbs, which was found that, thalidomide, and later again case control study was done for that. The advantage being, it's fast, it's inexpensive, and it leads to hypothesis formation, which will lead us to further take up with other designs which are stronger to actually look at whether there is causality, and or maybe if there is association first and then causality. The disadvantage, there is no comparison group, no statistical sampling method, and there is chance of bias. Coming to the next kind of design, that is a cross-sectional, which is very commonly used. A very good or simple or common example of this is a survey. It can be in any form. It can be by physical sampling, physical survey, that is distributing questionnaires. It can be by Google Forms. It can be even telephonically, so whatever way, but it's a cross-sectional study, that is survey. It's a single examination. That means you're doing it at one point in time, all the data collection. And it involves a cross-section of population. It's very appropriate for chronic diseases. Result is applicable to population if I take the sample representatively, which Praveen will tell you about representativeness. And it can be retrolective or prolective. Now, these are terms which are not very commonly used. So just to give you an idea, I might do it backward direction or forward direction. So these are some things which can be done depending on, again, where I'm collecting it from. It can be records or wherever else. The use is to define, the magnitude or determine the magnitude of the problem or disease, and it helps in planning of health services as well. So you take a group of people, and it's something like, if I can give you an example, it's akin to taking a picture. So when you take a still picture, it gives you at that time whoever was doing what, and you are seeing that. So it's something like that. The advantage is it's easy, it's fast, and it gives you the prevalence rate. So that's why another name of this study is also prevalence studies, because it gives you the magnitude or the prevalence of the problem. It also in a way helps you to generate hypothesis when you can try to see what was there or what was already the exposure at that time and what the people are having at that time, that is the outcomes. The disadvantage is it only gives prevalence, not incidence. Incidence is the new cases which can happen in a particular population. Prevalence is old and new as well. There's no temporal association. That means what came first? Was it the causative factor or the outcome? Or something like, it's the chicken or the egg story. And it's not suitable for highly fatal disease, because by the time you're trying to determine, some people might have already been lost to fatality or of short duration diseases. Coming to the next type, that is the case control study. Now this is a very important and a strong design comparatively. Now please remember, many times people do confuse. Now here you have two groups, as the name suggests, case and control. So you have two groups, that is a case and a control. Now as the name suggests, case is anything that has an event or the disease under question, and controls are everything else but not having the event or the disease under question. And that's the fundamental. Please remember, you think of case control and then think of, you have to have a group which has the event under question or event of interest, and without the event of interest would be control. And you're trying to compare these exposure. Very importantly, the study starts today, but we are trying to find out what happened yesterday, day before, or 2 months in the past, or 6 months in the past. So retrospective. And that's why another name is retrospective studies. It's a most feasible design where disease outcomes are rare because the outcomes have already happened. So when a disease has a long latent period, or it's rare, or it's expensive to obtain data, that time you can conduct these kind of studies. So you will have groups of people who have the disease and controls without any disease, and you will go back in time, you look at the different risk factors, and then you will try to look at the association. And this is the typical design of, so you start here, but if you see, the direction is backwards. So you take people with cases, that is the outcome or the interest event, and people who do not have that. And in both the groups, you are asking whether the interest factor or risk factor is there or not. You ask for that history of exposure in the past. Please remember, it's in the past. So you're relying on memory. Or sometimes you might also look at the investigation reports which are documented, which is obviously more reliable. Okay. So you ask for the risk factor history in both the groups, cases and controls, and then you make comparisons. So here the steps are, crucial steps are, you select cases and you select controls. Now usually we do 1:1. You can go up to 1:2, 3, and 1:4. That is 4 controls for each case. Please don't go beyond that, because studies have documented that beyond 4, you do not gain anything. It's again a waste of resources and manpower and other things. Then we match them. That means cases and controls are matched in such a way that they are very similar. Okay. It ensures comparability because you cannot compare apples with oranges. So you need to have matching. And then you measure the exposure and analyze. Very quickly to go through, basically here we look at the exposure rates among cases and controls as well. And then we determine something known as odds ratio. Now this odds ratio tells us whether the odds of a particular exposure leading to disease is, how is it supposed to be associated with that. So if we get the odds ratio as 1, that means there is no association. If the odds ratio happens to be more than 1, 1.2, 1.5, 2, 2.53, whatever, that means there is an odds of association of that factor with the disease, or rather we'll say this is kind of a factor which leads to this. Whereas if I get an odds ratio less than 1, that's a negative association, or in other words, that factor is protected. That means if I have that factor, or if I am exposed to that particular thing, or if I'm eating that means it will protect me from getting the disease. So case control study helps you in rare diseases. It has a relatively smaller sample size. There's no attrition which happens. And then there are some limitation, bias. Now, one of the important biases is recall bias. You're asking for people to remember the things which happened in the past. That obviously will have biases, sometimes recall bias, sometimes even investigators bias, interviewer bias. Many a times these kind of things happen. And then what happens to the exposure after disease sets in? So we're not sometimes taking into account that. And the disease itself can influence the behavior of people. So all these are the challenges. Coming to the next group, which is very important, that is the cohort study. Now, cohort is a group of individuals sharing same kind of experience or characteristics. It can be from similar geographical area. And the examples are, you can have people working in a particular workplace, you can have people who were born in a particular hospital or maybe in a particular year, or it can be even people who attended a particular event like guests at barbecue. It can be anybody. It can be people in a class or people like you all who attended this webinar can be my cohort. So anybody who shares similar characteristics. So here you start with a group of people, and they will already be like, over a period of time, there will be people who are in two different groups, so depending on the exposure, and you look at outcomes. So you take them and follow them, and later you will find that people who are exposed and there will be people who are not exposed, and you see whether the disease happens in them, and you compare the outcomes. So that's what we do. And in this, the direction is usually prospective. It can also be sometimes retrospective or mix to cut down on time. But generally speaking, cohorts are prospective, takes longer time. And since the outcome has not happened, it usually requires a huge sample size. So you're starting with the exposure and going forward to see this. And again, here we have something known as relative risk, which is kind of in a way similar to give us the kind of association between the factor associated with the outcome. So relative risk, basically what is the chances of a person getting the disease if there has been an exposure. And there is also something known as attributable risk. So what is what percentage or what amount of or what proportion of the disease is caused by a particular factor. So because diseases are multifactorial. So if I say smoking causes lung cancer, now how much of lung cancer that I see is because of smoking? Why does it help, or how does it help? Why is it important? Because if I know that 70% of lung cancer is because of smoking, then if I cut down smoking, or if I remove smoking, or if I say bring in my methods or education, and if people stop, then I can bring down that level of lung cancer by that much percentage. That's how it helps. So attributable risk is again calculated. I will not go into details of that. And there's something known as population attributable risk also. Coming to something known as experimental studies. Here, the investigator is controlling the environment. I am trying to do what I want to do, and I will assign them to different groups. So usually we do it for patient management, or sometimes licensing and labeling of drugs, new devices, medical procedures. You varied some kind of step in some kind of procedure, or even sometimes to improve the diagnostic, therapeutic, or prophylactic procedures. So that's the idea for doing these. And one of the best known studies for this experimental studies is randomized controlled trials, or RCTs. Now here, the investigator controls the predictor variable. That means whatever is my intervention or treatment, I control it and I decide how it will be. The major advantage is that you have the ability to demonstrate causality. That means this is already there and this will lead to that. So this helps us. Randomization controls unmeasured confounding as well. And usually we do it only for mature research questions where we've already got some idea. Please remember, this is known as the gold standard among the study designs, epidemiological study designs, and gives you most convincing evidence for relationship between exposure and the effect. Now, basic design is like this. You have two arms. So you take a sample from the population and then you divide them into treatment arm and the control arm. You randomize and do that. And then And then there will be treatment or no treatment in each of the groups, sometimes placebo, though there are ethical concerns with that. But please remember, certain times you may still be able to do that. But generally, otherwise, placebo trials are not really advocated nowadays. So you do that and then you measure the outcomes. And based on that, you will come to conclusions. So basically, if I want to know the prevalence, then I should go for a cross-sectional study. If I'm going for incidence, that means new cases, I should go for cohort studies. If I'm looking at causality or association between the factor and the outcome, so I should go for something like cross-sectional, that too analytical cross-sectional, case control or cohort. If I'm moving from cross-sectional to case control to cohort, if you see, the reliability increases because each of them is a stronger design, and that's why I put the arrow there in the box going from the base to up in that box, if you see here. And then if I'm looking at prognosis, I would like to go for a cohort study. Natural history, that means how does a disease progresses right from the pathogenesis or pre-pathogenesis to the outcome, whatever I'm looking at, whether it's the cure or the outcome in the form of coma or death or whatever. So I should go for cohort because it's a prospective or a longitudinal study. If I'm looking at a treatment effect, so I should go for a randomized control trial. So again, to give you a summary, so all these things, the best type of study designs I have given you so that you can have an idea. Now, just to summarize, there could be descriptive and analytical. As I've already told you, we can have case reports or case series which are single individual or single group defined according to the disease. The better design would be cross-sectional, where again you have exposure and disease at a single point in time. But the unfortunate thing is, most of the times, you may just describe it. Sometimes you also analyze it, and that's where you within that you make a group. Ecologic, I've already told you that it's a population or the geographical area where you have not the single people as an individual, as a unit, whereas you are taking it as a group. And among the observational designs, analytical studies, you have the case control and the cohort, which both have comparison groups. Cohort is obviously a stronger design compared to a case control study. And experimental is a intervention studies where you are assigning exposure, or you're trying to manipulate some things, or you're trying to vary a particular procedure by manipulating a particular step. And if you look at the hierarchy of evidence, there's something known as systematic reviews and meta-analysis, which are at the top. Just below that would be the randomized control trial, that is RCTs, and then cohort, case control, then other things, and case reports are not very highly rated. So we shall take questions at the end. Please write down or put your questions in the chat box. And this is how we go for the study designs. So this is just an overview of the whole thing in a nutshell. And now I would like Praveen to take over, and Praveen will take you through the steps of sample size determination and sampling methods, sampling techniques. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. This is going to be my first formal session. Yeah, am I audible?
Yes, sir, you're audible. You can go ahead.
Yeah. So we are going to discuss for say next 25 to 30 minutes on how we exactly estimate the sample size. So I'm going to keep this session very simple so that most of us we go to the statisticians for the reason that we want to calculate the sample size. And first thing I want to tell you before I start this session is the sample size should be calculated before starting any particular study. Some people come with huge bunch of the case records and they come and say, sir, what should be the minimum sample size? I've already done my study. So keep that thing in mind when you are doing any research. Sample size estimation should be done beforehand. So these are going to be the session objectives. We'll discuss what are the advantages and disadvantages of small and large sample size. And then we'll enlist some common outcomes in research studies. And then we will discuss about some formulae that are used for assessing the sample size. Okay, this all we started with selection of the topic. Then we collected and evaluated existing information. We call it as a review of literature. We discussed about research questions. And just now, Dr. Animesh sir discussed about the relevant study designs. Now I'm going to discuss about how we are going to define our study subjects. When we need to define our study subjects, there are two components. One is something called as estimating the sample size, how many subjects are to be included in the study. And second method is, if I know I need to have 300 subjects in my study, how am I going to enroll them? So we call it as a sampling technique. So these two components we'll be covering now, and these are few of the things which we are going to cover over a period of time. This is a very important concept that all of us need to understand. When I want to estimate what is the prevalence of, what is the hemoglobin concentration, say, hemoglobin concentration among Indians. There are two ways in doing it. One is, what I'll do is I'll go every house in India, that's how the census is done, and 1.5 billion, whatever population we have, I take blood sample from each one of them, and at the end, I will say, this is the mean hemoglobin concentration among Indians. Is it possible at all the circumstances? No, this is not a very feasible option. Okay. Instead, what do? We take a sample of subjects and we estimate hemoglobin concentration among them. And whatever hemoglobin concentration we get from our sample, we call it as a sample mean. And from sample mean, we are going to infer the population mean. Let me give another very simple example. If you want to estimate hemoglobin percentage of a person, concentration of a person, there are two ways in doing it. Suck out all 5 liter blood from his body and estimate hemoglobin concentration net and tell him, this is your hemoglobin concentration. So, and the other way is, take 1 drop of blood sample from his body, estimate hemoglobin concentration in it, and extrapolate that hemoglobin concentration to the entire body. This is the whole concept of sampling technique and the sample size estimation. How accurate is going to be your sample mean? That is going to decide to what extent you are near to the reality. So population mean is reality, and sample mean is what you get from your study. So whatever you get from your study should be more or less equal to the population mean, so that your results are going to be more precise. So this is what I was talking to you so far. There are two ways. One is something called census enumeration, where you are going to take the whole census, entire population in your study, and you carry out your investigation, which is not feasible. Instead, we go for sample enumeration, which is, you are taking a representative sample from the entire population and you conduct your study so that you can extrapolate the result to the rest of the population. So a lot of people say, if this is the common kind of a problem we encounter. I do a study with larger sample size. I go to the statistician or to somebody, and they will say, this is too much of a sample size. You could have done it with a very small numbers. Why did you do it with so much of sample size? This is a common question. On the other hand, if I do a study with a very small sample size, people come and, oh, this very small sample size, the results are not generalizable. Okay, so you need to strike a balance between large sample size and a small sample size. So what are the advantages of having large sample size? As I was talking to you, if you take a larger sample size, whatever estimate you get with the sample will be more or less near to the population parameter. Okay, so this is very simple, right? If very easy to understand. If you have large number of people in your study, whatever you are going to observe will be more or less same as that of a reality. If you take a small sample size, it is not going to be more accurate. Okay? Second is, it is going to give you the better estimates. And if you are planning for checking the difference, difference in hemoglobin concentration between males and females, then whatever difference you are going to observe, that difference is going to be more stronger. You can with more confidence say that this much is the difference. and there are going to be very small amount of errors. We have something called as type 1 error and type 2 error. Whatever errors you are going to observe, they are going to be very less, very small if you have a larger sample size. But what are the disadvantages? It is going to be very expensive. It is going to be loss of time, waste of manpower, more support facilities are required, and ethical issues are involved. More importantly, sometimes students come to us, they say, sir, I did this study with say 2,500 subjects. Having a larger sample size is a kind of a prideness. So when we say that, when we tell him with 2,500 sample size, whatever you are getting, you could have just got it with 560 sample size. So what has happened? The number of resources that you are going to use, that has exponentially increased. Okay, if you can get a result with a small sample size, if it's the same result that you get with a larger sample size, why do you want to go for a very large sample size in doing the study? So what are the advantages and disadvantages of small sample size studies? So they are less expensive, less time consuming, and manpower and support are going to be less required. And what are the disadvantages? You are not going to detect if there is a clinically important difference is that it is difficult to detect with a small sample size. I think most of you are seasoned researchers. You might have experienced, you get some difference in your clinical scenarios, and when you want to do it using a research study, you won't get a statistical significance. And when you take it to a statistician or when you submit it to a paper, they will say sample size is insufficient to come to a statistical conclusion. Okay, so these are very commonly seen adjectives, verbs, phrases, whatever we get. So these are all very commonly encountered there. Okay, so efforts, your efforts may go waste, and sometimes there are going to be larger test errors. So Animesh sir was talking just few minutes ago about your study objectives, how they decide the study designs. And similarly, the sample size calculation is also dependent on what is the outcome of your study. Okay? So what could be, there are usually 4 outcomes in any kind of research. There could be more also, but now I am covering 4 important outcomes. Number 1, you may be estimating proportion in one group. You call it as a prevalence. You may be interested in estimation of mean in one group or average in one group of subjects. Or you may be planning to find out the difference in proportion between 2 groups. Or you may be interested in finding out difference between 2 means. Let us take these examples. They will make it clear to you how these outcomes are actually defined. Please remember, there are 4 outcomes. Number 1, it could be a single proportion, it could be a single mean, it could be difference between 2 proportions, or it could be difference between 2 means. I'm going very slow for the reason that it is difficult to understand these concepts, and sample size is a very important component of our research design. Let us see these hypotheses. The chat box is open. So I request you to kindly, put it in the chat box. What are the answers for these research questions? I think one of our resource persons can kindly guide me with whatever responses are coming. So I have told you there are 4 outcomes. Number 1, single proportion, single mean, difference between proportions, difference between means. Now I'm going to put a research question. You need to tell me what is this out of those 4. Okay, I don't want to read it, just read it and tell me what is the outcome. What is, you want to find out what is the prevalence of anemia among women residing in the rural community.
Okay, there is an answer. Single proportion. So most of them have answered single proportion.
Perfect.
You are all says prevalence.
Perfect. It is a estimation of single proportion. Perfect. Well said. What about this? What about this? Yes. Many are responding.
Yes, most of them are answering as mean, average.
Yes. Single mean. Perfect. Well said. Okay. Now what about this?
Someone has answered difference in proportion, average, mean,
Prevalence
prevalence.
ratio.
The answer is there are two groups now. There is one group that is women residing in the rural areas, and other group is a women residing in the urban areas. So what is the outcome? Prevalence is always a proportion, right? So what we are planning to tell here is difference between two proportions, whether women in the rural area have got a higher proportion of anemia compared to women in the rural areas. Some had answered with a mean. Okay, we will come to it. Okay, so the people who are now the last option, please check what it could be. What is the outcome? Yes, perfect.
Difference between means, difference in average.
Yes, this is what is difference with average, difference between two means. So if you understand these core concepts, now we can build our sample size calculation based on it. Okay, so please remember there are 4 outcomes, and I will be talking about these 4 outcomes only in my next 15 minutes with the examples. Okay, so before actually going to this formulae for calculation of sample size, we need to understand few concepts. One very important thing that everyone needs to remember is what is allowable error. Most of the times people will, our sample size calculation depends on what is the allowable error. I'm just going to explain it in a very simple way. If you do a particular study and you find out this is the prevalence of anemia in a rural community. For example, I do a study, and at the end of my study, I will come to know that the 35% is a prevalence of anemia in the rural community. Do you think that if there are 10 individuals who perform a same kind of a study in different settings, are they going to get 35% only? No, right? So there can be some variation. This is called as I am going to commit that variation. What is the extent of variation I can allow in my study? So what I will do is I will do a study and I will tell to the world I estimated this sample size, and with this sample size I am going to get some prevalence. Okay, and in that prevalence I allow this much of error. If I say that in my study I am allowing 10% error, if final outcome of my anemia study is prevalence of 35%, I'm going to tell the world that it may not be 35% if different people do this study at different settings. It could range somewhere from 35 plus 10%, 35 minus 10%. So it could be somewhere between 25 and 45%. This is the amount of error I am going to allow in my study. I am committing it at the beginning. What happens if you commit too much of a error? If your error is too much, for example, I commit 30% error. So what is going to happen? So you are allowing larger error in your study and your results are not going to be believable. So you are allowing so much of error in your study. Okay, so this is the important concept that we need to remember. Maybe you would have experienced this situation when you take your study sample, prevalence to the statistician. They would have said, we can adjust the allowable error so that it is going to reflect differences in the sample size. Okay, so very important thing that we need to remember is to not allow larger allowable error. Keep it less so that we are going to have a better estimate. Okay? Now coming to another important study, there is a question that is popping up. What is the power of the study? So you refer to any of the books, they complicate the term power of the study, bringing in the concept of hypothesis. I do not want to do that. Okay, my way of understanding power of the study is very simple. What is power of the study? You do a study and you say that drug A is better than drug B. You do a study. And at the end of the study, you describe that drug A is better than drug B. That is the outcome of your study. My question is, there are two possibilities. In reality, the drug A may be really better than drug B, or you may be wrong. The drug A may be having same kind of an efficacy as that of drug B. The power of the study is extent to which you come to a conclusion that there is a difference, and in reality there is a difference. You are more powerful in saying that there is a difference. To say there is a difference, you need to have a power. On the other hand, there is something called as alpha error. We fix these two. What I do is, in power of the study, we usually put the, fix the power of the study to be 80%. What is this 80%? 80% of the power of the study means if we come to a conclusion that drug A is better than drug B, and in reality, drug A is, better than drug B 80% of the times. On the other hand, alpha error is a very dangerous phenomenon. In alpha error, you say that there is a difference. You say that drug A is fantastic than drug B. And when you give that drug to the people in the community, there is no difference at all. In reality, there is no difference. It is alpha error is usually, compared with the innocent being declared as criminal. So there is no difference in reality. The null hypothesis is true. There is no difference. But at the end of the study, you come to a conclusion that there is a difference. And this is wrong. You are advocating wrong treatment to the people. This is called as alpha error. So this alpha error has to be fixed to 5%. It should not be more than that. You are allowing the chance to occur only 5% of the times. At 5% of the times, you give a chance. Whatever difference I get, that difference may not be a true difference, or it could be because of chance. To some extent, this alpha error is reflected in your p-value. Okay? So I am not going much into the error. So this is what is basically required for sample size estimation. Now we have few formulae for estimating the sample size. You may be wondering why this person is speaking about the formulae. There are so many softwares available for the sample size estimation. Maybe some people would have wondered also. But what I suggest is for the beginners, but as a, people with 30, 40, 50, 60, 80, 100 publications, they still use estimation of power, sample size manually. Okay. And you may be very comfortable using the software. Please remember, softwares are there, and you need to feed correct information to the software to give you the correct sample size. To feed what to be fed to the sample, software, at least for that sake, we need to know what are the formulae for the sample size estimation. Please remember this particular concept. These are the formulae that we are going to use. Okay. I'm not going to talk how the formulae are derived, what is Z alpha, what is it. It is not, I am not a statistician by, either a profession or by my, I didn't learn much about it. So this is what I do is only with the practice and the passion I have with the subject. We are going to discuss the 5 formulae. Okay, let us be very fast now with 5 formulae. And I have already told you there are 4 basic outcomes. One is, in any of the study, you may be estimating a single proportion. You may be estimating a single mean. You may be estimating difference between 2 proportions, or you may be estimating difference between 2 means. Okay. So out of them, this is the first scenario that I'm going to give you. So please read this scenario and tell me what is the outcome. I'm just going to go into the chat box. Please let me know what is the outcome in this particular study. Is it single proportion? Is it single mean? Difference between proportions or difference between means?
They're responding, one person, yeah, most of them are responding as a single proportion. That's
fantastic. This is a single proportion. Proportion of a parameter is single proportion is the outcome of this particular study. If your outcome is single proportion, this is the formula used for sample size estimation. Very frequently used formula for calculating the sample size. People call it as 4pq by d square. I've seen some people, this is the only formula for sample size calculation. Irrespective of what is the hypothesis, they don't look at the outcome. Okay, a person comes, what is your study? My study is this. Okay, use 4pq by d square. That is wrong. Okay, please remember the samples for calculating sample size of single proportion. We are going to use this particular formula where P is what is a reported proportion or reported prevalence based on your previous studies or the literature. Q is 1 minus P or 100 minus P. Okay, so if P is a probability of occurrence of the event, Q is what is the probability of that occurrence to not to occur. If 35% is a prevalence of anemia, what is the probability that anemia is not there in the community? 100 minus 35, that is 65. And this is the number which I was talking to you before. What is the amount of error that you want to allow in your study? That is, usually we keep in this study, it is kept as a 10%. Usually it is 10%, 5%, 3%, 2% based on the requirement. Okay, we fix this allowable error. I substitute everything into it. So 1.96 square, my P is 28%. That is the headache, whatever they have. And Q is 100 minus P, that is 72. And my allowable error is 10. So I'm going to do a square of it. So the total sample size I am going to get for the study is 77. Okay. This is, sorry. So this is the second scenario. So please let me know what is the outcome in this particular study. Single mean, okay, it has come before. Okay, so fine, it is a single mean. Please remember, this kind of single mean studies are not very commonly used. Okay, so we use single proportion very commonly. Difference between proportions very commonly. Difference between means very commonly. But single proportion is less common. And in this situation, the formula that is going to be used is Z alpha by half square into S. S is nothing but the standard deviation, and D is nothing but the allowable error, or you can call it as a clinically expected variation. Okay, you may say if I do 100 HB percentages, HB mean HB 100 subjects HB concentration, the variation could be around 0.8. This is what usually is done. So I substitute everything into it, and I will get my sample size of 26. So please remember, when calculating sample size for the single mean based studies, mean is not given importance, standard deviation is given more importance. Please remember it. Okay, standard deviation is going to give more information about what is a variability in the data. If your data is more variable, your study is not, the results are not accurate. If the standard deviation is very less, very minimum, so you say that your results are more accurate. Okay. So we will discuss about the standard deviation and all in the next session on descriptive statistics. Okay, this is a third, scenario. So what is the outcome in it? Is it single mean, single proportion, difference between means, or difference between proportions? Yeah, okay. So you can just look at this.
Most of them say it's difference in proportion.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am. So many, this is what is, if you give high dose of a drug, how many people die? And if you give low dose of a drug, how many people die? Usually people die. This is usually expressed in terms of percentages. What is the difference between two percentages? Okay. So if your study is having objective of finding out what is the difference between two proportions, the sample size formula that we are going to use is this. Please remember, in the first example, it was a single proportion, and P, you immediately got it from the literature, and the P that you got, the probability, prevalence, proportion, whatever. But here, there are two proportions, 16.7 and 4.2. Which one will you take? In this condition, when you are doing difference between two proportions, you need to take average of these two percentages, that is 16.7 plus 4.2 divided by 2. So we call it as a pooled prevalence. So we take this pooled prevalence for calculating the sample size, calculating our P. Okay. And what about D? Here, the allowable error is, you are not going to decide on what is the allowable error by yourself. So here you have a clinically meaningful difference. What is the difference? What is the difference in mortality rate with high dose of a drug and low dose of a drug? What is the probability of death with a high dose of drug? 16.7. What is the prevalence with the low dose of a drug? 4.2. 16.7 minus 4.2 is going to give you the meaningful difference. Okay, that is going to give you the variation. That variation will come as a D. Okay, so this is, we call it as a clinically meaningful difference. If I substitute everything, so I'm going to get the sample size of 125. Don't worry about what is Z alpha, what is Z beta. They are all fixed numbers. Please remember. Okay, so you need not calculate Z at all, absolutely not required. It is fixed. Z alpha values are fixed. You go to any software, Z alpha value, it will take by itself. You need not give it anything. What you need to feed it, you need to feed it what is the prevalence in the first group, what is the prevalence in the second group. It itself will calculate what is a meaningful difference and it gives you the samples. So if you, whatever number you calculate using this formula, you need to have 125 subjects. Whatever number comes out of it, that number is going to be what you call as numbers in each groups. Some people do, they calculate sample size using this number and they say that I will divide 125 into 2 groups. That is not correct. So whatever number you get here, that number should be equal in both the groups. Okay? And this is the next scenario. What is the outcome in this? Perfect. Perfect. This is difference between means. Okay, so what is a mean with low dose of a drug? What is a mean with high dose of a drug? Mean duration of hospital stay with the low dose of a drug and high dose of a drug. Okay, so for if your scenario is like this, so the sample size formula which can be used is this one, that is Z alpha plus Z beta square into S square into 2 divided by D square. S is again pooled standard deviation. If you look at it, there are two standard deviation, 19.93.8 and 89.1. Both of them should be added, divided by 2. You are going to get a pooled standard deviation. And so you are going to get the clinically meaningful difference is difference between 61.7 minus 33.2. If you give a low dose of a drug and high dose of a drug, what is the difference in the mean duration of hospital stay? That is going to give you the clinically meaningful difference. Using that, you put all of them together and you will be getting the sample size. Okay, so the sample size is going to be this. I substitute everything and I will get the sample size that is equal in both the groups. Most of the clinical trials are going to use this particular formula. Okay, the last two formulas which I told, most of the clinical trials and experimental studies, case control studies, cohort studies, where you have more than one group, you are going to use this kind of a. And this is the last scenario. There is some difference with this scenario, right? Initially, we used to say there are two groups, independent groups, but here the groups are not independent. One group is there before intervention and after intervention. Are you getting me? So what is the outcome? Is it difference between means or difference between proportions? Difference between means. So for example, before giving propranolol, what was the mean blood pressure? After giving it, what was the mean blood pressure? Usually this is another important kind of a study which most of us do, right? So some people were asking educational research kind of a questions. I have one group of students, and before giving them a teaching method, I will assess what is their knowledge score, and after giving them the teaching intervention, I want to assess what is their knowledge score. So the score is usually measured in terms of mean. Okay, so for those kind of studies, this is a formula that we are going to use. So we are going to give all these PPTs to you so that you need not note down any of these formulas. And there are softwares available. I'm going to tell about those softwares at the end of my presentation. Please remember, these are the things that we need to look into. Okay, I will put it, and we need 9 subjects. So each group is error over here. So you need to have 9 patients, measure their blood pressure level before giving propranolol, and then give them propranolol, then assess what is the blood pressure level, compare between both of them. So this is not 9 in each group, totally 9 subjects are included in this particular study. These are very frequently asked questions. I just saw I'm just looking at the chats also. So I'm trying to cover them over here because we may not have much time at the end of the presentation. Someone was asking, is it the calculation of sample size is mandatory in all the studies? It is desirable. It is very important that we need to fix our numbers. Sometime fixing is going to be difficult. There are 4 or 5 common kind of scenarios with which people come to us. Number 1, you said when you are calculating sample size for proportion, you need to give that P, that is a reported prevalence. Someone else would have done that study sometime before. But there is a situation that no one has done that kind of a study before. I am the first one who is doing that kind of a study. What do? I do not have the P, prevalence, for calculating my sample size. In that particular situation, you have 2 options. Number 1, you do something called as a pilot study. Pilot study is, you do a miniature kind of a study, a small study on 10-15 individuals, and from them you assess that prevalence or mean, and using that calculate the sample size. So this is number 1. Doing pilot study is also not possible. At that point in time, you can take that P, that is prevalence in 4pq by d square, that P can be taken as 50%. Maximum probability of occurrence of an event is 50%. I will take that maximum probability and calculate your sample size. Sometimes people say, sir, I am doing a study on deep vein thrombosis, sir. I do not know how many cases of deep vein thrombosis come to my hospital. If I commit, I need to select 80 subjects. And sometime if I do not get 80 subjects, what is going to be my fate at the end of the day? At that point in time, we still suggest people to fix the time period. I am fixing my time period as 3 months, 6 months, 1 year. All the subjects who are coming to my hospital during that particular period of time who fulfill my inclusion and exclusion criteria will be included in the study. This is also another way of doing the study, doing the sample size estimation, where you do not fix the number, you do not commit, but whoever all come to your hospital with a particular outcome, having inclusion, satisfying the inclusion and exclusion criteria, you are going to enroll all of them in your study. Okay, this is called as census enumeration in the hospital setting. Sometimes people use a hospital statistic. For example, sometimes you won't be having sample prevalence for vitiligo. You may not be having prevalence for pityriasis. At that point in time, they come with 1,000 patients have attended my dermatology OPD. Among them, in last 1 year, I have got say 300 individuals were having pityriasis or vitiligo. So we calculate proportion out of it, and we calculate the sample size. And the last one is these are multiple sample size calculation softwares available. I suggest you to go for OpenAP, which is free of cost, which is available in the public domain. You can utilize it for calculating the sample size. I wanted to demonstrate it, but because of paucity of time, we have one open house on the last day. Please ensure that I will demonstrate this to you on that particular day. And the CMC Vellore has developed a software called as InMaster, and that is also available. If you go to their workshop, they are going to give you free of cost. And if you want to purchase, you can run a free trial for 1 month. And if you really want to use it frequently, you need to purchase it. There are multiple. There are so many. I do not want to read any one of them. If this slide will be given to you, you can utilize it whenever you want to use them. Okay. I will stop at this point. So this is all was there in my store as of now. So before going to the next session, which is going to be very short for 10 minutes. So if you have, I try to answer a few of the questions. If the moderators would like to ask any questions based on the summary, something which is burning, I can answer them, or we'll go to the next session.
So there are a couple of questions. If there are multiple factors being compared, how does one calculate sample size? And which factors do we take? And I think it must be which factors do we take if there is no literature available? This is one
If
question.
no literature available, I think I've already told, if you do not have a literature, you need to do a pilot study, or you need to, fix a highest amount of probability and calculate the sample size. And you do not have a literature at all, if it is a clinical hospital-based study, you can fix a period and then do the calculate the sample size. That is one way of doing it. And coming to the first question was something related to multiple factors. For example, this is a common problem. A lot of people come to us. Sir, I want to study the effect of smoking, alcohol, hypercholesterolemia, triglyceridemia on myocardial infarction. Among these four, which one should I use for calculating the samples? Is the question. I think this is the same problem I think the person who has asked this question had. In that particular point in time, if you are having multiple factors, the factor which has got the least prevalence should be used for calculating this. Smoking is 60%, alcohol is 40%, then hypercholesterolemia is 30%, then triglyceridemia is 10%. You use this 10% for calculating the sample size, so that other all will get covered. I will just proceed further so that we have some time at the end for answering the questions related to the study designs also.
A lot of questions are coming in, so I think
we'll finish it off, then we'll take the questions.
Yes.
So coming to the last second part of my session, that is sampling technique. Once you decide, I need to have 300 subjects in my study. How do you select those 300 subjects so that your subjects are going to be the representatives of the whole population? Why do you need to use this representative sample size? Representative sampling for the reason that if you have a representative sampling, the results are going to be generalizable. Okay, so please keep in mind, having a representative sample is going to make your study more generalizable. So here we are going to discuss, this is what I was talking to you. This is a whole population. We take a subset of population using some scientific methods, and based on that, we do the study on them and we extrapolate the result to the rest of the population. So sampling is a procedure of selecting the subjects from the society or the community and ensure who are going to be my part of my particular study. Okay, please keep this in mind when you are doing the sampling technique. A well-designed study, very good objectives, smart objectives, calculated the sample size very well, and if you do not have a proper sampling technique, the whole thing collapses. Please remember, sampling technique is as important as that of a sample size calculation or other part of the study. This is what I was talking. This is how we can classify the sampling techniques. There are two ways in doing it. One is something called as probability sampling techniques and non-probability sampling. What are probability sampling techniques? The probability sampling techniques are the one where each person in the community or each person in your study group has got equal probability of being or allocated a particular drug. If I have 100 students in my class, I want to take 10 among them for my particular study. All 100 should have equal probability of being in my study. This is called as probability sampling. It's also called as random sampling. And the other one is something called as non-probability sampling, where you do not attach this, concept of equal probability of being into the study. You select the subjects based on your preoccupied notion or a preoccupied concept. Okay, so let us discuss each one of them very shortly. The first and most common method of sampling is simple random sampling. This is what is usually done, lottery method. So there are 100 students in my class. I want 10 among them. So I'll write all 100 names in different sheets. I will take one among them, one by one, until I get 10. So this is very simple, called as simple random sampling. Lottery method can be used for it, or we have something called as random number table. You can use this random number table and select the subjects. Sometime we give this random number generation to the computers. I'll feed my Excel sheet. In the MS Excel, you can do it. I will tell MS Excel, there are 100 subjects in my class. I want, I feed all their roll numbers and I'll tell Excel, you select 10 among them and give to me. So Excel is going to select 10 among them randomly and it will give it to me. So what has happened here? Neither I or me nor the study subjects have got any, hold on who are going to be the part of my study. Please keep in mind, let me explain it again. In probability sampling techniques, neither the person who is including the subjects in the study nor the person who is going to be the part of the study, they do not have any idea on who is going to be in the study. So everyone is at equal probability of being in the study. That is why it is called as a probability sampling. So simple random sampling is the most commonly used, most simple way of sampling technique. Simple random sampling is a common sampling technique which is more probable. Other one is something called as stratified random sampling. I have 100 students in my class. I divide them into strata. Wonderfully performing students, moderately performing students, low performing students. I have 3 strata. And among them, I will select some subjects randomly. Again, I will do the simple random sampling. So I have 100 students in my class. Okay. 30 are extraordinarily well performing. 30 are moderately performing. 40 are not so good. What I will do is I will make group of 40, group of 30, group of 30, group of 30, group of 40. And I will make chits of them. I will randomly select the subjects from those groups. So the first step is stratifying the subjects, and the second step is apply again simple random sampling among them and select the subjects to be included in your study. And the third one is very fascinating, called as systematic random sampling. So I will be selecting every 5th or every 6th or every 10th subject, 10th student in my study. So what decides how many every 5th or 10th? I like number 5 more, so I am going to include it. It is not correct. So what we do is, if I have 100 students in my class, I want 10 out of them. What I will do is I will divide 100 by 10. So how much will you get? Very simple mathematics. 10. Okay. So what I will do is I will include every 10th student in the class. If I want 20 out of 100, so how I am going to do? I am going to divide 100 divided by 20, and how much you are going to get? 5. This 5 is called as a sampling interval. You divide the whole population by your sample size, you get your sampling interval. And from that sampling interval, select every 5th, every 10th, every 12th, whatever sampling interval you are going to get. This is called as systematic random sampling. You are systematically randomizing the, collecting the number, identifying your study subjects. Okay, so this is what we discussed so far. Simple random sampling is, there are 100 students in my class. I will write 100 names in the chits. I will take one by one. So till I get 10. This is called simple random sampling. Systematic random sampling, I divide the subjects into strata. It could be strata based on the performance. It could be strata based on their state, or it could be based on their economic status, anything. And from them, I'm going to select the subjects into my study. It's called stratified random sampling. And the systematic random sampling is I'm going to select every 5th or every 10th or every 15th based on my, what we call as sampling interval. Let us come to the non-probability sampling techniques. We have something called as convenient sampling, judgmental sampling, quota sampling, and snowball sampling. So this non-probability sampling, there is no equal probability for every participant to be a part of my study. There is some kind of a notion attached with it. The first and very common, I say it is not a very good method of doing the study, selecting the samples. We call it as convenient sampling. I have 6th-term students who are going to be very convenient to be a part of my study, because community medicine is taught in 6th and 7th term, and they are the best one whom I can easily capture and collect the data from it. So I will concentrate only on 6th-term students. This is what we call as convenient sampling. This person stays next to my home and he is easy to capture. I'm going to include him in my study. We call it as convenient sampling. Convenience is based on your convenience. So what is the problem associated with it? The representation is not going to be there and the results are not going to be generalizable. And this is another type of sampling called as purposive sampling, or it is also known as judgmental sampling, based on what is the purpose of the study. I want to assess what is the hemoglobin concentration among thalassaemic patients. At that point in time, you'll be including only thalassaemic patients. You are not going to include everyone. Okay? So you include the subjects based on the purpose of your study. We were doing something called as distracted driving study. How many people are having distraction when they are driving two-wheelers? So at that point in time, if I go to the community, I should not include everyone. Who are going to be my study subjects? Only individuals who ride two-wheelers. So this is based on your purpose of the study. The selection of samples is based on the purpose of your study. You call it as a purposive sampling. And the last sampling method which I'm going to deal now is snowball sampling. Snowball sampling is nothing but you want to do a study on substance abuse among medical students. And you go and ask them, do you consume substance? Are you alcoholic? Do you take drugs? 99.999% of the subjects will say no. At that point in time, what we do is, for example, if the study is on smoking habit among the medical students, we catch hold of one student who is definitely a smoker and go to him. Ask him who else do this. He may reveal it. And go to them. Ask them who else are involved in this. Go to them. Ask them who else are there in it. So this is snowballing. You increase your sample size. This is what is done in COVID right now, right? When they're doing cluster containment strategies, what they did is they went to the person who is having contact with a positive COVID patient and they asked him with whom else you came into contact. And for them, they went to them and they asked whom else you came into contact with it. This snowball keeps on increasing. So this is called as snowball sampling. So far we discussed probability sampling techniques, non-probability sampling techniques. In probability sampling techniques, there is equal probability of everyone to be a part of the study, more scientific way of doing sampling. And there are 3 types in it. Simple random sampling, which is very as simple as that of a lottery method. You randomly select individuals. Second is stratified random sampling. You divide the subject based on the strata, and from each of the strata, you'll be selecting the subjects randomly. And in the systematic random sampling, you do the systematic inclusion in the study based on a particular sampling interval. It could be every 5th, every 6th, every 10th. And in non-probability sampling techniques, the most crude and the very primitive one is something called convenient sampling. Based on your convenience, you include the subjects. Second one is, purposive sampling. Based on the purpose of your study, you will be including the subjects. And the third one is snowball sampling. As you ask one particular person the question and you keep on increasing your size of the samples. You call it as a snowball sampling. You increase the size of your snowballing. This is all I wanted to discuss. Thank you very much for your patient listening.
Okay, Praveen, you can take a sip of water because there are a lot of questions for you.
Definitely. We'll finish off the questions related to the sample, study design. So Animesh sir can.
Yeah. Are there specific sample formulas that we use for specific study designs? Is one question.
Huh?
Are there specific, I did not understand, are there specific sample formulas that we use for specific study designs?
Definitely. That's what I was telling you, right? If your study is a cross-sectional study for prevalence of the, you want to identify what is the prevalence of a particular disease in a community. Your outcome is single proportion. At that point in time, what you are going to do is, you are going to use the first formula, 4pq by d square. And if your study design is a case control study, you want to find out how much is the exposure between the subjects who are having the disease and do not have the disease. At that point in time, you are going to use the sample size formula for the proportions. If you want to do a clinical trial, you want to find out whether there is any difference between two means, you are going to use a sample size formula that I told for the difference between two means. Okay. So everything is interlinked. There is nothing, there is no watershed line between different parts of the study, conducting the study. Everything is lean.
Next question, actually, a couple of people have asked this question. How to calculate allowable error?
Yeah, so allowable error, we do not calculate, we fix it. We fix it based on our intuition. Okay, please remember, someone has very beautifully mentioned it all depends on the confidence interval. Okay, it depends on confidence interval, number one. Second one is, if my prevalence of a disease is 35%, okay, please remember, the allowable error should be something less than 35%, agree or not. For example, if prevalence of refractive errors among the school's children is 10%, I want to calculate a sample size for it. I take allowable error of 10%. So what message you are going to give at the end of your study? There can be the refractive errors somewhere between 10 plus 10, 10 minus 10, something between 0 and 20%. It means you are allowing so much of a variation that which is not going to be feasible. Please keep in your mind, whenever you are fixing your allowable error, keep it at least 10% of the overall prevalence. That is going to give you more better idea about sample size estimation. It is going to give you a good number.
Next question is, what if the prevalence is very low? How to calculate sample size?
Low prevalence, high prevalence, I have given the formulas. They are the one which are to be used for calculating the sample size.
Yeah, I think this was answered.
Called as a different sample size.
What are type 1 error and type 2 error?
Yeah, I will cover about type 1 error and type 2 error, I think, in the last session or maybe in the next session, because it itself is a huge thing to discuss. So I will talk about type 1 and type 2 error at the end. Okay, I don't want to confuse you because you got so much of information today. I don't want that information to get diluted if I speak about
Exactly.
type 2 error now. They are a bit complicated to understand, but I will tell them at the end of the
Next question is, for a pilot study, can 10% of the total cases be considered?
Definitely.
Then how many literature we need to check to calculate sample size?
One very good reference, when done meticulously, is enough. Publish.
I think it should suit the local needs, contextual needs of that particular population. It should suit.
Yeah, that's what I'm telling you. So whatever study you are going to choose for the calculation of sample size, you need to keep that study under a total check. Evaluate the study for all possible requirement. Take consort statement. Anita was telling last session, right? You take Strobe, you take consort statement, any type of a method to evaluate a paper. You evaluate that paper with all the local context, whether they are addressed or not. Based on that, you take that particular study and calculate the sample size. The study which you choose for selecting the sample size should fulfill all the basic requirements.
Next question is sample size calculation the same as census enumeration in a time frame for a CASI experimental study?
Oh, it's a very complicated question. Can you repeat it, please?
Is sample size calculation the same as census enumeration in a time frame for a CASI experimental study?
No, sample size estimation is not that of a census enumeration. Census enumeration is you are including everyone. For example, there are 10,000 people in my area, in Mysore. I include all 10,000 individuals in my study. So that is called a census enumeration. In sample size calculation, we do not do the census enumeration. From that particular population census, I include some subject based on the scientific method. So that is what we call as a sample size estimation. So in sample size estimation, there is no much rule for the census enumeration.
Now this question is about stratified sampling, and she is asking whether number of samples should be same in each strata.
It's a very good question. I want to congratulate the person who asked this question. It need not be. Okay. For example, I was referring to a study where I want to include 3 groups of subjects. One group of subjects are excellent, well-performing students. One group of subjects are moderately performing students. One group of subjects are, low-performing students. So what I need is, I need 30 subjects. Okay. In your class, there may be very less number of students who are performing very well. There could be only 10 students who are performing very well. Okay, and there could be 60 students who are not, performing moderately, and there may be 30 students who are not they are poor in their performance. I cannot take equal number in both the groups. Then the representation is going to fail. So what I do is I take the probability proportionate to each of the groups. I will take 5% in each. Okay, so 5% of 10, 5% of 40, 5% of 80. So another 30. So ultimately, I give equal representation, proportionate representation to each of the groups. It is not same. It is based on the probability of occurrence of that event across different streams.
Okay, next is, how do we use random table?
Random table is as simple as you open the random table and you take a pen, place it on one of the number in the random table. That is going to be your first number. Again, close your eyes, put on another number. That is second number. Neither you know, nor the person who did the random number knows, nor a person who is going to include them in the study knows. So nobody knows it. Their numbers are very haphazardly arranged.
Okay. Next question is snowball technique exclusively used for qualitative studies?
Not necessarily. Even in quantitative studies, we use it. Not exclusive. It can be used even in quantitative studies. As I told, if you want to assess what is the prevalence of substance abuse among the medical students, so that is a quantitative study, I use it for assessing prevalence of substance abuse. I keep going one by one, and
there are people who want to know what is cluster sampling, what is quota sampling, and one more something else. Yeah, these two: cluster sampling and quota sampling.
Okay, so
and what is purposive sampling?
I think I've already explained what is purposive sampling. Purposive sampling, something which is very much attractive to me now on the table is, I want to finish this off first, which is very close to my heart. What is the sample size calculation for the qualitative study? No, in qualitative study, we do not calculate the sample size. Please remember. Number two, it is all based on the purpose. Okay? So we do not use it. Coming to your question. Number one, what is quota sampling? Quota sampling is same as that of stratified random sampling. What is quota? Quota is a group. 2A quota, 2B quota, general quota, this quota, that quota. They're all quotas. They're all strata. In stratified random sampling, after we divide the subjects into different quota or the strata, next method we use is simple random sampling for the selection of subjects. For example, I have 3 quota: well-performing students, moderately performing students, underperforming students. And from each of that quota, I want 10% of the subjects. So what I do there is, out of 40, I need 4. How do I select those 4? I again write all those 40 names in a chit and select 4 randomly. But in quota sampling, in the second stage, the first stage remains same, divide them into strata. In the second stage, I do not do the simple random sampling. I do the purposive sampling and select the subjects, or I do the convenient sampling, select the subjects. That's why it is called as a quota sampling. Quota sampling is a counterpart, non-probability counterpart of stratified random sampling, where you do not select the subjects based on the random method. You select them based on a non-probability sampling. Cluster sampling is, a bit difficult to explain at this point in time. The person who asked this question, if I can, send a detailed description about cluster sampling to him, because of paucity of time, I think cluster sampling, we will keep it in the parking lot. Please hold on for this question. On the last day, we'll discuss it.
Next question is, how can I calculate sample size where I do not know the population number? Example, I want to calculate geriatric prevalence in a ward for next 6 months.
Don't calculate the sample size. You go to the pediatric ward, you fix the time period, next 6 months. Whoever geriatric patients come to your study, include them. So this is called as a time-bound sample. No need to calculate.
For sample size calculation, if similar studies conducted in other countries, can that be taken as a reference?
If there are no population confounders, take it. One of the student they came with and they said, sir, in my study, the prevalence of cognitive deficiency in elderly is reaching 99%. I was surprised. Why this is 99%? How can it be? How all our elderly became cognitively ill? And when we checked, what is the tool he used for sample size calculation, and whether the tool used for data collection was the tool that was developed in Los Angeles. There were 3 questions. What is the time now in Los Angeles? What is the name of the pizza shop that is there in the some corner of New York, which these people won't be knowing at all? How will they respond? Okay, so study you include for calculating the sample size, please remember whether the local contexts are matching. Based on that, you collect the samples. Based on that, you include them in this.
Next question is, I saw one very good question. Yeah, can weighted mean be used in uneven data sample?
Yes, definitely. They can be used. Weighted mean can be used.
Okay, somebody wants to know, please explain what is a quasi-experimental study.
Yeah, quasi-experimental study. Animesh sir want to explain about it, or shall I?
Yeah. So quasi-experimental, as the name suggests, it's not really a pure experimental study. So basically what we are doing is, in experimental, as I said, the investigator is assigning the participants into 2 groups. And the heart of that usually is in a randomized control trial is the randomization. But here, we are not doing that. We are not randomizing. We do allocate, and many a times we use certain other things like parameters, like sometimes even a natural distribution or certain other things which are easier. So that's the idea. So here we are not doing a total, like randomization and allocating into 2 groups, but rather than that, we are trying to allocate them into different groups decided by the investigator, or sometimes it's predetermined, or it's maybe naturally distributed, and that's why we put them and then we compare. And obviously the results are not as strong as you would expect in an experimental study. So that's the thing about quasi-experimental studies. It's not really experimental, it's a quasi.
Okay, thank you, Animesh. The next question is, what is multi-stage sampling? Dr. Praveen?
Yeah, multi-stage sampling is you stage. For example, I want to assess how many subjects are having anemia in one particular area in Karnataka. So what I do is I will randomly select one district out of 32 districts in Karnataka, and in that one district I will select one taluka, and in one taluka I will select one primary health center, and from that one primary health center I will go to one sub center, and from one sub center I will go to one village, and I will take around 100 women in that particular village and do the HB estimation among them. So this is multi-stage over a period of staged you staged your sample collection procedure from state till the sub center. This is called as multi-stage.
Okay, one last question. I think most of the other questions you have answered. Can a case series design be used to try a novel procedure or drug?
Sir, Animesh sir, will you answer?
I didn't exactly get the question. What I understand is somebody is trying to tell that, can we do a case series for a new procedure? Again, how do you, like, as I said, the policy is there is no control. And what I understand is you're trying to answer whether the new procedure or a novel drug or a new drug, is it better than the previous? And if I don't have a comparison, I don't think I can emphatically answer that. So I would not advise that. But this is from what I understand of the question. Probably, like, if more clarity, the person can get in touch later. One more question, I think, Vijay, I had seen earlier in the chat before, I went out and went in again. And so I think there was somebody has asked a case control study. Can that be like, is it always retrospective or can it be prospective? And I think somebody asked even, can it be a mixed prospective, retrospective? See, ideally, traditionally, the definition has been retrospective. That's what we've been saying, but it's not really like necessary. Please understand the fundamental thing is, in a case control, we are going from outcome to exposure. Whereas in the case of cohort, it's exposure to outcome. So if we can have something like, even if you're doing, and there are, I don't have like time to give you the exact details, but there are studies, and I can send it across, that there are studies sometimes which have been done with cases taken and the controls taken, and then the parameters have been assessed later. So there is a possibility like that. It's not that you cannot do it. But please remember that the essence is that you should start with cases and controls or the outcomes in mind and go to measure the exposure. I hope I have clarified.
Actually, for this prospective case control studies, even I have some studies which we have done in our department. I can share the proposals to them so that they can go through.
Right.
And if like the assignment which we gave on the first day, designing a protocol, if someone has done it already, then they can send it across to us so that we can take it up for discussion in one of the uh, sessions. So if you have any study that you have already designed the protocol earlier, already submitted for ethical clearance, already approved, still if you can share it with us, then we can go through that and then you will understand these things better. There's one more question. What is the difference between feasibility study and pilot study?
Yeah, pilot study
Okay.
is a type of feasibility study. Pilot study is usually done. One of the objective of the pilot study could be to check the feasibility. Do you have any other explanation?
No, I don't think there is any other explanation to it.
It is the simplest way of explaining.
Yes, I think that's the best way to.
Does pilot study require ethical clearance? Yes, every study requires ethical clearance. You can mail, somebody is asking whether we can mail the protocol to you. Yes, you can mail it or you can even send it on the WhatsApp.
Mail would be better, I believe, because it's easier.
Can you please type in your, last time I had given all our IDs.
Yeah, I've just given Praveen's ID. Somebody wanted, I've just put.
Yeah. No, you can please mail it to our IDs, your study protocols, so that we can take it up for discussion anytime. We have shared the emails. People are asking for the email. All the 4 IDs are there here. Right? So, thank you very much, Dr. Praveen. That was really, personally, I should say, I learned a lot from your presentation, and it gave me such clear insights into so many things. Thanks, Animesh, also for clarifying a lot of questions and for that session. Sriharsha, can we wind up for the day?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, thank you, Vijay ma'am, and thank you everyone for patient listening.
Thank you, Praveen. It was very nice. Within the time, I think it was very well done. Thank you. And thank you, Vijay Lakshmi, for moderating and taking those questions and, making sure that most of the things were answered. Thank you so much. And thank you, team, Dr. Sriharsha, Rashmi.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Praveen sir and Dr. Animesh sir for an excellent presentation. With this, we wind up today and we'll see you again on 21st May. Thank you.
Yes.
Bye. Good night.
Bye.
Good night. Bye.